Hi everyone, my name is Kayla Arrey and I am a fourth year President Scholar and Honors student. I'm an English major with a minor in journalism and I'm so excited to share my project with you today titled The Effect of Trauma Experiences on Student Journalists in Higher Education. I did my project alongside my mentor, Dr. Chelsea Reynolds, who teaches journalism in the Department of Communications and Sexual Communications in the Department of Human Communication Studies. Before I get started talking about the research that I conducted for this project, I want to talk a little bit about the context and the history that led me to my interest in these topics, specifically student journalism, mental health, trauma reporting, and journalism pedagogy. I spent 6 semesters with CSUF's Daily Titan newspaper. This is an independent, completely student-run organization, and during my career there, I had multiple positions, including an assistant editor, a main editor, and most recently their editor-in-chief from summer 2021 through fall 2021. During my time there, the newsroom covered a variety of traumatic events. These included these included stories about car crashes, suicides, campus safety threats, a murder, pandemic-related coverage, and more. Off to my left, you can see some of the biggest headlines that ran while I was working there. And while we were covering these events, I noticed that there were a lot of after effects that started to run into our newsroom. When I was seeing these after effects take place, I noticed a couple of patterns. First, there was a lack of support for student journalists. This meant whether that was from mental health resources, outside mental health resources, or talking about in our classes, I noticed that a lot of student journalists in my newsroom relied on each other and themselves to get themselves through the emotions that they felt after covering these events. In our classes, there was also a lack of curriculum surrounding trauma reporting. So a lot of times when professors would talk about trauma, they would talk about it in a way that said, you probably are going to face trauma, but there wasn't a lot of talk about how to process the emotions that went on with it, how to move on from those traumatic events, and how to create realities that were sustainable in the long term so that we could go into careers and continue to cover these events and still take care of our mental well-being. There also seemed to be a lack of awareness for mental health. This isn't to say that mental health conversations were not happening, they were, but they weren't focused on healing, they weren't focused on getting better. They were mostly just acknowledging that these mental health struggles were happening. So there was a lack of awareness for mental health healing and trying to get better and sustain ourselves in a healthy way. There was also a lot of isolation, so a lot of student journalists who relied on purely on themselves to try to get them through these traumatic events or the coverage that came along with it, and also just a general increase in anxiety and depression and burnout. And so by the time I had finished my 6 semesters at the Daily Titan, I really became interested in trauma and student journalism, and I began doing research more broadly on trauma and journalism. And the good news is that I found a lot of research about journalism. The problem about journalism and trauma. The problem with that is that a lot of that research applied specifically to journalism professionals, meaning these were people who had graduated college and moved on to the journalism world or were working full time in the journalism world, and they didn't extend into university newsrooms. So this is the kind of research that I found. 80 to 100% of journalists have experienced a traumatic event at work. 92% report that they've experienced at least 4 traumatic events. And what we were seeing is that these statistics did not include student journalists. These were full-time journalists in the professional industry. But knowing that this was happening in the professional industry, we know that student journalists are preparing to go into this world. And so I thought that it was really important that we start taking these conversations down into university newsrooms. There are really big organizations right now in the journalism world that are talking about trauma. And some of those organizations are the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma and the Poynter Institute, which have been really phenomenal in creating new conversations about trauma, mental health, and journalism teaching and healing. But like I said, these conversations weren't happening as much in the student realm. And so my project aims to take those voices, the student reporter voices, and bring them into the light in these conversations and give them a seat at the table. So for my project overview, I took my own journalism experience, so my reporting experience, my interviewing experience, and my writing skills, and applied them to this project to do a series of interviews with student journalists from across the country. I talked with them about their mental health struggles, their trauma reporting experiences, and the changes that they want to see for the future. The series of interviews gave each journalist a space to be vulnerable, to talk about everything that they've experienced during their time as a student journalist, and most importantly, what they want to see change and what they want to see better happen in the future. The goal of this project is to raise awareness for trauma in student journalism and illustrate a greater need for proper trauma training and mental health support for student journalists. So after conducting 9 interviews with different student journalists from across the country, whether these were editor-in-chiefs, illustration editors, staff reporters, I ran into these big topics of coverage and I turned them into news stories. I wrote 7 different news stories, each about different topics and relevant ideas that were brought up by each of the student journalists. So the 7 different news stories that I wrote, the first one was an introduction to the series. The next one was topics of coverage. So whether the students, they covered things such as suicide, shooting, murder, and general violence in their campus areas. There were also mental health outcomes. So talking about things like burnout, depression, anxiety. Anti-media response focuses on the idea of fake news and how that affects student journalists' view of the future. Coping mechanisms, whether that was dissociation or distancing from your work or anxiety, and also educational interventions, and most importantly, recommendations for the future. So after writing these news stories, I came upon a bunch of different conclusions. These were the most important conclusions that I gathered from the qualitative data. The first one was that these student reporters exhibit a heightened sense of strength, resiliency, and courage. A lot of the student journalists that I talked to were not getting compensated enough to make this their full-time job, meaning that they were still sustaining other jobs outside of this. They had family responsibilities, and they were working usually over 40 hours a week within their student newsrooms to produce content and keep their paper running, meaning that they were really functioning like a full-time professional daily newspaper, but they were still students at the same time. Also, many of the students relied on adrenaline to help them survive a traumatic moment and produce the content and the story for that moment, but they lacked time to properly address their emotions. So a lot of students who covered things like shootings or a murder on campus or a suicide said that they relied on the adrenaline of the moment to get them through that, but then after the story was published, they didn't have time to sit with that story. And part of that is because of the 24-hour news cycle. So the idea that you have to keep publishing content 24/7 because the news is ever evolving and ever changing, that really didn't leave them a lot of time to process their emotions. And also the 40-hour work week. So while they're continuing to produce content, that leads to more hours, more working 40 hours, not a lot of work-life balance happening. Another conclusion was while some university journalism courses may broach topics of mental health and trauma, many students said that they didn't do enough to prepare them for everything they face. So a lot of students in the study said that, yes, their professors mentioned trauma, they talked a little bit about it, but they didn't talk about how to process it, the kind of human emotions that can pop up from it, how to move on from it, and how to sustain yourself in a career that is potentially riddled with these traumatic events that you have to cover. Some of the common mental health outcomes for students in this study included triggers, burnout, fear about the future, and anxiety. Different coping mechanisms they developed included dissociation, distancing from work, emotional breakdowns, which were usually a product of repression of their emotions, and personal intervention. So a lot of student-to-student intervention, learning when a student is suffering and then stepping in as another student journalist to help them. And another thing was students felt unsupported by a variety of factors, whether that be their journalism pedagogy, so classes that they were taking that didn't prepare them for what they faced, university administration, whether it's not supporting them financially or not supporting them out socially within their campus and promoting their readership. The general public, so feeling like their readership is low, they're not reaching enough people, they're receiving backlash from students or critiques. And then outside mental health resources, feeling like there's a barrier when you bring in an outside mental health resource because it's hard to talk to somebody who is outside of the realm of journalism, who is outside of your newsroom. It doesn't really understand the daily struggles that you go through. And so, yes, I developed a lot of conclusions from this study, but I thought the most important thing that I want to leave you with is the changes for the future. How do we take these conclusions and make them into a brighter future for the student journalists who still have such a passion and such a light in their student newsrooms and still want to produce such amazing content? One of the things that we really want to encourage is better mental health resources. So a lot of students in the study explained that when they brought in a mental health resource who was not affiliated with maybe the university or not familiar with journalism, it felt like an emotional weight to have to explain to that counselor why they were feeling the way they were feeling after covering such a traumatic event. And so it led to a lot of misunderstanding, I think, between the counselor and between the students, and they want some just more, either more options for mental health resources or resources that are more attuned to journalism, the journalism industry. So I thought the best way, I've been talking about uplifting student voices, listening to student voices. I thought the best way to show you why these changes are so necessary is by letting you hear from the students that I talk to, because these quotes are really powerful and they really exemplify why these changes are needed. This quote's from an editor-in-chief of the Daily Egyptian at Southern Illinois University, and she talks about why bringing in an outside counselor isn't always the best solution.
Person, you're always still going to have these very emotional responses to what.
Excuse me, I can play this quote instead.
The disconnect.
I think that that's definitely a huge part that could help a lot more. I think that the counselors have the general knowledge to say, like, here's how you can deal with trauma, but they're not in our shoes where we're sitting in here and the day after we hear another student trying to take his life too. They're not seeing the consistency with it. And I think that that's a huge aspect of.
Another thing that we talked about with a lot of student journalists was reshaping journalism pedagogy. So talking about how a lot of the classes when it comes to trauma don't accept what we call a people first mindset. So acknowledging that while journalists are meant to be factual, are meant to be unbiased, we are still humans before we're journalists, which means that we experience human emotion, we process trauma just like humans would before we try to address it as journalists. And this was something that the editor-in-chief of Chapman University's student-run newspaper talked a lot about, and how she didn't see it in her newspaper or in her class, or not in her newspaper, but not in her classes either. And so she talks a little bit about that.
Person, you're always still going to have these very emotional responses to what people say and have to learn how to deal with that. And that's something that's just not discussed. That was not something that was gone over with me entering this role. That's not something that I really heard like in any of my classes at Chapman. The disconnect.
And another thing that we can work on for changes for the future is redefining newsroom standards. So the idea of work-life balance and the fact that students are working more than 40 hours a week is really unhealthy as a student, and it's something that needs to be redefined. Sometimes a lot of the student journalists said that they work so hard because there's this idea that if you work harder, you'll get better opportunities. You have to publish more stories so that you can graduate and get a better job. But a lot of that kind of mindset contributes to some of the burnout and the depression and anxiety that they were experiencing as well. And so this is a quote from a 2021 graduate and a former EIC of Ohio State University school newspaper, The Lantern. And she talks about how her newsroom didn't have work-life balance and how that was really damaging. Even after she graduated, and to this day, it was really damaging to her psyche and her mental well-being.
There is no work-life balance. Like, nobody in that newsroom had work-life balance, and like there were no boundaries. And that was something that was so, and continues to frustrate me to this day, because it's funny because we were student paper running like a real daily, and there was just no leeway with like, if I'm a student, if I'm in class, something's breaking, I'm going to be multitasking.
Some other changes that they talked about that I didn't include quotes for, but I think are really important, are creating more conversations like this one that we're having today that are outside of the newsroom, that are to the general public, that are to faculty, that are to staff, to acknowledge that these problems are happening, that trauma in student journalism is real and that it needs more attention. Also creating spaces for active listening. A lot of the student journalists that I talked to said that they were intimidated or about talking to other people outside of the newsroom because it is very specific and it is very vulnerable to kind of talk about these experiences. And also having trauma-informed counseling, so working back from some of the negative stereotypes that students should be grateful that they get to cover these types of events because it's good for their portfolio, or college reporters should be able to bounce back because they're young and this isn't even their full-time job, they're not in the field yet. So kind of working back from that and creating counseling spaces that acknowledges that trauma in student journalism is 100% real, and it needs to be addressed and it needs to be validated.
There is no.
And so I just want to end with a big thank you to Dr. Reynolds. She really believed in me and helped me build this project up. And to all the student journalists that trusted me to tell their stories, hopefully that this can be a step in the right direction towards some change and some more conversations about trauma in student journalism. Thank you so much, and I look forward to answering any questions.